Today we're going to start talking about groups, group roles, group tasks, and then Tuesday we're going to talk about we're going to broaden it a little more to talk about sort of the organization of groups. So yeah, today's like a precursor to next week, but it won't be too long today. Let's see. We're going to start by talking about like definition of a group, and then we're going to go into the dimensions of a group, the structure of a group, and the sort of roles that occur within groups, what we can consider role emergence, role specialization, and role fixation. These are some terms that are going to come your way in this little mini lecture today. So before I get started, any questions? Any questions on latest material? All your grades should be back, papers, journal article assignments, exams, forum posts, most recent ones. So you can look at for those. I don't think I have notifications set up when you get a grade, so make sure to check those if you haven't yet, and reach out if you have any questions. Otherwise, let's get started. So definition of a group, right? So you can think of it in two ways. We have what might be considered a group in itself and a group for itself. That makes sense. Hopefully it will come to make sense. So a group in itself is like a group with some identifiable characteristic that everyone shares. People with brown colored eyes, people who are above 6 feet, people who work for a wage as compared to like people who make most of their money from a business that they own or the profit that comes in. It's just like a category. Think of this group in itself as like a category or a classification. But then there's the group for itself, right? So a group for itself is what we're going to talk about mostly today. And a group for itself can be considered like a human communication system composed of 3 or more individuals, right? So interpersonal communication is 2 people. Anything after that is a group, more or less, if you're dealing with 3 people. So in this group for itself, right, I said it's a human communication system is one way to think about it, at least in the field of communication. And this is a group composed of 3 or more people acting for the achievement of some common goal. And the people in this group are influenced and influenced, or at least have the potential to be influenced and influence others within the group. So a group in itself, as I said, think of this as like a category, an objective category, if you want to use that term. Although sometimes people can absolutely be placed in like wrong categories, or categories can be entirely made up for the purpose of, whatever, discriminating, subjugating, as in social constructs, like historical social constructs like race and gender. But anyways, like I said, group in itself can be these objective identifiers, classifications, categories, just some sort of physical or some sort of trait that you have, right? Or demographics even, like if you come from a low income group. Group for themselves, though, meanwhile, are sort of consciously being taken up by the members of that group. So this is often, though not always, coming from people within one of those objective group in itself. People coming within that group, coming together for a common cause, right? So like a group in itself turning into a group for itself. So bringing back, I think one of the examples I said was like wage workers, right? So that consider a category, a classification of workers who earn their money through a wage. An instance of a group, of this group in itself coming together to be a group for itself is in the case of workers from like a specific company or maybe an industry trying to unionize, right? Trying to harness some sort of collective power or cohesiveness and use that to pursue their common interests of, better working conditions or something like that, right? So that's a group for itself. Then we have, within groups, we have a task dimension. There's 2 dimensions. You have a task dimension and you have a social dimension. At least this is what we're talking about today in this context. So task dimension is like, right, the tasks that need to be done, the work performed by the group. Think of it a little bit more in economic terms about output and productivity. Task dimension is the result of the efficient and effective accomplishment of a group task. Is this sort of the output productivity is the result of the efficient and effective accomplishment of a group task is what I meant to say. And that's like a sort of metric you can see for how well the group's doing, especially in work context where you're actually producing something material. So that's a task dimension, right? So the social dimension is the relationship that formed between members in the group and their impact on the group as a whole, right? So think of it a little bit like the group in itself and for itself distinction. Group in itself has, they're this category because they have these tasks that they share in common, or this, yeah, right, so they have this task that they share in common. Group for itself comes together when they realize they share some of these tasks, or once they know that the same task that they do is being poorly compensated for, right? In the case of workplaces, they share this sort of common feeling of maybe being taken advantage of by the same employer. A sense of cohesiveness can come from this, and that's part of like that the relationships that form between members as they come to understand themselves as part of a group that is influenced and can influence. So of course, like a sense of cohesiveness can take place without these sort of negative things like labor exploitation causing it. cohesiveness can come about, right, from a satisfying workplace. Or think about this in like a neighborhood, a community, but in the workplace setting, cohesiveness can come about like just as well if everyone is compensated fairly, if there's a sense of fair management, if there's freedom of expression, or simply if like, there's a fun environment, right? This all about this sense of cohesiveness and maintenance of the group. So another way to think about this, if you want a definition besides social dimension definition, the relationships that form between members in the group and their impact on the group as a whole. And then we have, like we did with the task dimension, we have this thing called output productivity. In the social dimension, we have what's called output cohesiveness. And so output cohesiveness is the degree to which members feel a part of the group, wish to stay in the group, and are committed to each other and to the group's work. So again, you can think about this group in itself with that task productivity, group for itself, in terms of the cohesiveness and seeing that they have a common purpose and a common goal, and sometimes a common enemy, sometimes. So in workplace settings, but in groups more generally, the goal is kind of, a goal at least can be seen as one that's like trying to find the optimum balance between productivity and cohesiveness, right? So one of the big critiques of our economy and our workplaces today is that like these sort of productivity profit model coupled with like a individualist, like careerist or like professional self-interest, these sort of attitudes can kind of stifle cohesiveness. It can encourage competition within the workplace, and it can lead to workers feeling like alienated from their work, from the products of their work, from what they do and from what they produce. And so I was like, think about like, have you been a member of any groups that put too much emphasis on one dimension, like getting the job done, no matter what it takes, at the expense of cohesiveness or fair treatment or et cetera, right? So think about that if you need to sort of personalize it, right? Then going on from the dimensions, right? The task dimension, the social dimension, we have the structure of a group. An equation that we have here in our field is norms plus roles equal the structure of a group. So norms are, right, those broad rules, informal rules, sometimes formal, that designate appropriate behavior for all group members. Then we have roles, which stipulate specific behaviors that are expected for individual group members to take on. Then we have the structure, right? Norms plus roles equals structure. The structure is the interrelation of all the parts of the whole. In this case, the norms and the roles are the parts. So a couple types of roles. First, it can be broken down in one way, which is a formal versus informal role. You can have like a position assigned to you, right? Designated to you officially as your job at the company, for instance. And it's a role that's independent from the person filling the role, right? So it's a role that's there and you are just filling it. Then these come with like job titles or team leader designations, assistants, things like that, right? Then we have informal roles, which are, these sort of emerge from group interaction, sort of organically, group transactions, and they emphasize like these sort of social functions of the group. And in these informal roles, there are duties and behaviors still that are sort of implicitly defined by repetitive communication transactions within the group, sort of like how we talked about with the social constructionist perspective in routinization, right? Naturalization, institutionalization, things like that. Repetition is a big part of that. So from here, right, you have the formal and the informal type of roles. There's also get designated between task roles, maintenance roles, and self-centered roles. So let's see. We have the task role. So that is extracting maximum productivity in your task for the group. So a manager, for example, is one task role, and they have to try to extract maximum productivity from the rest of the group. That's their job. Sometimes extracting maximum productivity from the group requires maintaining the cohesion, which leads us to the maintenance role, which means that you can have more than one role at once. So the maintenance role is about gaining and maintaining group cohesion, as I mentioned before, with the social dimension and the output cohesiveness model. So on top of the manager, each person has like their own sort of tasks and maintenance roles, however formal or informal. An informal example would be someone who like brings in coffee every day or every Friday or something, and it's like a thing that people are collectively excited about, and the person takes on this sort of informal yet expected and very much appreciated role in a way that kind of helps maintain a sense of collectiveness and like in it together type of mentality, cohesion. Then, right, so we have the task role, the maintenance role, then we have the self-centered role. So here is sort of focusing attention on the individual, serving the individual's goals and needs within the group, right? This is when you're thinking of yourself as an individual rather than just a group member. And this is when you might be thinking about your career, which sometimes if you value your career more, you're going to be doing stuff that might go against cohesiveness. And this is where some competition comes in place within the workplace, trying to get promotion, things like that. So as I mentioned earlier, you can take on many roles at once, as in the manager with the task and the maintenance role, and you can perform different roles in different contexts, right? So you may even switch between roles within the same interaction. So again, let's focus on the workplace. A boss, for example, might be friendly with their workers in like in an interaction around, I don't know, in the break room, cafeteria room, or whatever. Very friendly with the workers, you know, however genuine or fake they're being. If they're being like friendly and trying to socialize with the workers that they otherwise manage, they're trying to do something like a maintenance cohesion role, right? But then if they're in that role, talking, being friendly, trying to be at their level, if one of the employees says something unexpected or what the manager deems as inappropriate workplace talk, they might switch back in that same interaction to their task role, which is trying to maximize productivity and make sure people are staying in quote unquote in line, right? So that's why task role for managers can very often be a disciplinary role. So, right, so we have these three roles. We can talk about roles in one way, formal versus informal roles, another way, task, maintenance, and this sort of self-centered individualist role. Then we can talk about role emergence. So role emergence is sort of like, how do we decide who plays what roles in a group? We have large groups, which tend to be more structured, because the larger the group, the more sort of structure you need to sort of make sense of all the different output and moving people within the group and diversity and within the group. You're going to need more structure if you're going to try to maintain that group. Small groups, meanwhile, very often the roles emerge from transactions more organically, not necessarily, but this is what the research has showed. Small local groups need less structure because there's already a sort of understanding of the way things are or are desired to be, and they emerge from organic interaction and transactions with one another. So that's how roles emerge. Then we can talk a little bit more about this emergence process. So we can have individuals who make a bid to play a certain role. We can have group endorsement of a bid that must occur for the person to play a role, right? Thinking about like getting letters of recommendation and things like that, or just getting respect for it. Or if you're trying to be a politician representing people, going around getting signatures so you can get your name on the ballot, that's group endorsement of a bid occurring for the person to be able to play the role that they want to play. And research shows that in an individualistic, competitive culture, high status roles are typically task oriented. Remember, as a task is more focused on that output and productivity, maximizing production of whatever the group has to be producing and doing. So high status roles, like I said, in these more competitive cultures, high status roles are typically task oriented. So facilitators, information givers, people who hold information and sort of manage a wide range of tasks for people that they have to do, is, at least in our culture, those are considered more high status, right? Because you're managing people, which has like this sense of superiority to it, almost like you're almost better than them or something like that, right? I'm not saying this is right. I'm just saying there are these high status roles that typically the status goes to the people in, you know, positions of power. Then we have maintenance roles, which are often perceived as like lower status roles. Supporters, encouragers, harmonizers, these sort of roles that are more emphasizing the cohesiveness aspect than the production aspect, are more lower status roles or less compensated for it, right? So if we step out of the workplace instance for a little bit and talk about mothers, right, and caregivers and volunteers, a little bit, in our societies at least, a little bit lower status in terms of like the respect that you get for your position that you're in, than say if you were like a CEO or a professional or a manager, right? People are always asking like, oh, what do you do for a living? And one of my friends who's like a 45-year-old mom, who's in my PhD program, is always like, I mean, I'm so proud of being a mother, but everyone always wants to know like what it is that I do for a living, and I don't have a professional role. And so she has this feeling of like judgment and like this lower status placed upon her because she's just a caregiver. Like that's her role. So that's just one example of that, stepping outside of the workplace examples, which we've mostly been talking about today. Then beyond that, beyond this emergence process, we have what's called a process of trial and error. So a group member will maybe attempt to play a certain role, and if not accepted by the group, will try another, right? Trial and error. They'll find their place within the group eventually, and they'll land somewhere, whether it's a high status role or a low status role, whether it has to do with status or not, they'll find their role. So how does a group accept a member's bid to play a role, right? So that's part of this understanding of process of trial and error. And individuals who insist on playing a specific role, despite lack of endorsement are often perceived as inflexible and uncooperative and selfish, right? So then we have role specialization. Once a role has been endorsed for you, that individual settles into their sort of primary role in the group. That doesn't mean they can't do other tasks, right? But they have an emphasized role. And again, whether it's formal or informal, very often formal if we're talking about an emphasis on one role that the group has like officially endorsed or assigned you to. But like an attempt to there's an attempt to perform what another member perceives as his or her primary role that might create some tension within the workplace, which can cause, or whatever group it is, which can cause issues with social cohesion, right? When people don't get the roles that they want, or when there's two people who want the same role, this causes tension in the group, which can, because it's affecting cohesiveness, that's going to affect productivity, most likely. That's the theory, at least, right? And most data backs this up in terms of organizational settings that are observed. And after that, we have role specialization, right? Or I mean, sorry, we just talked about role specialization. After that, we have role fixation. So a little bit more about this, like wanting to stay in your role and not being very cooperative about it or respecting the broader group's decision. We have what's called role fixation, is like the acting out of a specific role and that role alone, no matter what the situation might require. And as I said, that sometimes leads to a sort of like inflexibility and uncooperativeness once you do this one role so much, and then maybe if you're doing that job for 10 years and you're told after 10 years that you want to do something else, and the group has a very hard time accepting that, or conversely, you have a very hard time accepting the role that has been assigned to you, there's this issue of role fixation. So the opposite of that would be, at least what we're dealing with today, competent communication. Competent communication requires flexibility and willingness to adapt to the situation, changing your role when it's helpful for group's cohesion and group productivity. So how can you increase your competence? You can demonstrate flexibility, and you can be experimental, right? Flexibility and experimental are used in the same way here in terms of just trying new things, being comfortable with new situations that throw you into new positions or roles, more or less.